Would you torture a stranger just because you were told to? Most people say no. But in 1961, Stanley Milgram proved them wrong. He built a fake electric chair and a real machine that went up to 450 volts. He ordered ordinary people to push the button, and 65% of them didn't stop, even when the screaming started.
In 1961, the world was asking a question. How could ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty? The Second World War had ended. The trials had concluded. The verdict was clear. Orders were not an excuse. But the explanation felt incomplete. It separated monsters from normal people. It drew a line that felt too comfortable. A young psychologist at Yale University was not convinced. His name was Stanley Milgram. Milgram did not ask why people were evil. He asked whether obedience alone could explain it. Not hatred, not ideology, not violence. Just obedience. What happens when an ordinary person is told to hurt someone by an authority they believe is legitimate? The setting would be safe, clean, professional. A university laboratory. No prison, no uniforms, no threats. Just a desk, a machine, and instructions. Volunteers would be told they were participating in a study about learning, memory, punishment. They would not be told the real purpose. They would not know what was being tested. They believed science had rules. They believed authority meant responsibility. Milgram believed those assumptions were exactly the point. The experiment did not begin with cruelty. It began with a question and a willingness to obey. The experiment was explained carefully, not as a test of obedience, but as a study of learning and memory. Two roles were introduced: teacher, learner. The assignment appeared random. Slips of paper were drawn. The volunteer always became the teacher. The learner, an actor, was placed in another room. This was not disclosed. The deception was essential. The learner was strapped into a chair, electrodes attached. The procedure was explained calmly. This will be painful, the learner was told, but it will cause no permanent damage. The teacher was seated in front of a machine, a shock generator. 30 switches, each labeled with increasing voltage. 15 volts, 30, 45. The labels changed as the numbers rose. Moderate shock, strong shock, danger, severe shock. At the end, one final switch. XXX. The rules were simple. The teacher would read word pairs. Each mistake required a shock. With every error, the voltage increased. Before the test began, the teacher received a sample shock, just enough to feel it. It hurt, not enough to refuse, but enough to make the machine real. The man in the lab coat stood nearby, calm, professional. He represented the institution. The teacher asked a question. The learner answered incorrectly. The first switch was pressed. Nothing dramatic happened. No screams, no protest. Just a routine being established. The system was now in motion. At first, the shocks were small, routine, procedural. The learner made mistakes. The teacher pressed the switch. At 65 volts, a reaction was heard. A brief grunt, nothing alarming. The experiment continued. At 120 volts, the learner protested. He said the shocks were painful. He asked to stop. The teacher hesitated. He turned to the man in the lab coat, waiting. The response was calm. The experiment requires that you continue. No threat, no anger, just instruction. The teacher pressed the next switch. At 150 volts, the learner shouted. He demanded to be released. Silence followed. Then another wrong answer. Again, the teacher stopped. Again, he looked for permission to stop. Again, the authority answered, "Please continue." The language mattered. It removed choice. It framed obedience as necessity. At higher voltages, the learner screamed. The sounds were real, desperate, human. The teacher's hands began to shake. Sweat formed. Some laughed nervously. Others protested. "I don't think I should go on. I'm not responsible for this." The phrases changed, but the action often did not. When the learner fell silent, the teacher asked what to do. The response came immediately. Absence of response should be treated as a wrong answer. The switch was pressed again. At this point, many teachers believed the learner might be seriously injured, or worse. They continued anyway, not because they were cruel, but because they had transferred responsibility. The authority stood calmly nearby, accepting responsibility in words, while the action remained with the teacher. Obedience did not silence conscience. It taught people how to live with it.
When the sessions ended, the room went quiet. The switches were no longer pressed. The questions stopped. What remained were numbers. Milgram expected resistance. He believed most people would refuse early, that conscience would interrupt obedience. It did not. Across variations of the experiment, the result was consistent. When instructed by a legitimate authority, most participants continued. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. They pressed the final switch, marked XXXX. They did so while believing they were causing serious harm. Some protested verbally. Some laughed nervously. Some asked who would be responsible. But the majority did not stop. Education made no difference. Occupation made no difference. Personality made no difference. The situation overpowered the individual. When participants were debriefed, many were shocked by their own behavior. They described feeling trapped, not by force, but by obligation. I was just following instructions. It was the experimenter's responsibility. I assumed someone else was accountable. Milgram called this the agentic state, a condition in which a person sees themselves as an instrument, not an origin of action. Responsibility shifts upward. Obedience feels moral. Disobedience feels like betrayal. This was not sadism. It was conformity to perceived authority. When authority was removed, compliance dropped sharply. When others refused, participants found the strength to stop. The lesson was not that people want to harm. It was that most people will do harm if the system absorbs the blame. The results did not explain evil. They explained how easily it becomes normal.
When the experiment ended, the shocks stopped. The rooms emptied. The machines were turned off. But the question did not disappear. Participants were told the truth. There had been no real shocks. No one had been harmed. The screams were staged. Many felt relief. Then confusion. Then something heavier. They had believed they were hurting someone, and they had continued anyway. Some laughed it off. Some became defensive. Others sat in silence, unable to reconcile what they had done with who they believed they were. For many, the experiment did not end when they left the laboratory. It followed them home. They replayed the moment they pressed the switch, the moment they hesitated, and the moment they obeyed. The experiment was published, discussed, debated. It sparked outrage among ethicists and psychologists. Critics argued the participants had been deceived, that they had been placed under psychological stress without true consent. They were right. As a result, ethical standards changed. Informed consent became stricter. Oversight committees were established. The rules of research were rewritten. The experiment would never be approved today. But banning the method did not erase the finding. Stanley Milgram never claimed that people were evil. He claimed they were human, capable of kindness, capable of hesitation, and capable of obedience, even when obedience conflicts with conscience. The experiment did not prove that people enjoy cruelty. It proved how easily responsibility can be surrendered. When instructions are clear, when authority feels legitimate, when the system promises to absorb the blame, Milgram's work is often framed as a product of its time, the shadow of war, the memory of atrocities. But obedience did not end in 1961. The real lesson is not about a laboratory or a machine. It is about the moment we say, "I was just following instructions," and whether we stop before the switch is pressed.